Finally, when it comes to randomized control trials, I want to make you aware of judging bias in individual trials or reports of trials. The Cochrane Risk of Bias tool, ROB, which now is in version 2, is very useful for this, and I'll show you in a second what it looks like. Essentially, you're assessing bias that arises from 5 different domains, from the randomization process, bias due to deviations from intended interventions, bias due to missing outcome data, bias in measurement of the outcome, and bias in selection of reported results. Those are the 5 domains that the Cochrane Risk of Bias tool will assess. Before we look at this, I do want to point out that what is lacking here is a judgment of bias from processes and activities that are pre-randomization. Processes and activities which are necessary to actually conduct scientific studies. And we can think of these as research participation effects. And I've mentioned it before, but I just want to mention again that this is something that has been a little bit overlooked in the literature. It quite clearly isn't accounted for in this tool. And so there are papers here which I recommend reading, and there's also a seminar I gave previously, which you could have a look at if you want to learn more about these research participation effects and the biases that they induce, which are not covered by this tool. Nevertheless, this is a very useful tool. So let's have a quick look at this, and you can look at it on your own later. What this tool really is, and it comes in both document format like this and also an Excel sheet, which is actually quite useful. It basically defines 5 domains and signaling questions which you should answer to decide if there's a risk of bias. So we're just going to look at one of the domains and look very briefly at it. Domain 1, risk of bias arising from the randomization process. Signaling question. Question 1.1. Was the allocation sequence random? Now you could respond with yes, probably no, no, or no information. So they say there's an elaboration here where answer yes if a random component was used in the sequence generation process. Examples includes coin tossing, shuffling cards, etc. Answer no if no random element was used in generating the allocation sequence, or the sequence is predictable. Examples include methods based on dates, patient record numbers, allocation decisions made by clinicians or participants, etc. Okay, so you have to make a decision. Which one do you want to pick here? Question 1.2. Was the allocation sequence concealed until participants were enrolled and assigned to interventions? And here again, you can answer yes, probably no, no, and so on. And you can read how you should be judging this. There's elaboration here as well. Question 1.3. Did baseline differences between interventions groups suggest a problem with the randomization process? And you can read about it here. Then there are sort of information here that is important to remember. For instance, that the answer to the question should not influence answer to questions 1.1 or 1.2. For example, if the trial has large baseline balances, but authors report adequate randomization methods, then 1.1 and 1.2 should still be answered on the basis of the reported adequate methods, and any concerns about the imbalance should be raised in the answer to question 1.3, etc., etc. Okay, so the elaboration is quite elaborate sometimes, but it gives you 3 signaling questions to define the risk of bias in domain 1. Now, once you've responded to these 3 questions, there is an algorithm down here. The algorithm basically says, if you responded yes to question 1.2, go here. If you responded yes to question 1.1, go here. If you responded no to question 1.3, then there's low risk. And there's different ways of walking around this tree, and you end up in low risk, some concerns, high risk. And so this you could do manually if you wanted to. The Excel sheet that comes with the tool does this for you. So you just enter your responses and it calculates the algorithm for you. And then you shouldn't really trust the algorithm all the way, because you should also make your own judgment. The algorithm might decide that there are some concerns, But you might decide, well, actually think there's a high risk of bias. And so you have the algorithm's judgment and your judgment. And then for domain 2, there are signaling questions. It's just like before. And there are many more. And there's an algorithm here for that. And for domain 3, etc. So you go on through all the 5 domains and you get a plot that looks like the one I showed you before with the dots with colors, plus and minus signs and question marks. I find this tool incredibly useful. One, it's very useful for judging bias in individual trials, but it's also very useful as education material. Just pick up any trial you're reading and use this tool and read through the signaling questions, and you learn a lot about how to critically evaluate bias in a trial and the trial design itself.